Okay, it is now 12 o'clock Eastern Time. I think we can go ahead and get started. First off, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the third in our series of NYDFS webinars, Ready or Not, Uncovering Your Gaps in NYDFS 500 Compliance. We're going to be going over some secure cybersecurity clinics, give a Q&A, and a live clinic demonstration. So to start, we're going to give a quick welcome and do some introductions of the team here. Give an overview of our new secure cybersecurity clinics, along with the live demonstration, and we'll wrap up with a Q&A. All right, so introductions. I'll start off with John.
Hi, everyone. My name is John Jarrold. I'm a security risk management consultant here at WithSecure. My responsibilities include doing security assessments, cloud configuration reviews, design reviews of secure design reviews of designs, and sometimes web penetration testing.
And hi, my name is Richard Suls. Like John, I'm a senior security and risk management consultant at WithSecure. Sorry, and I focus on risk assessments, current state assessments, tabletops and crisis management exercises, a little bit of infrastructure review, NetSec, and in my spare time, I do expert witness work for the court systems in the U.S. And joining us is Miguel.
Hello, everyone. I'm Miguel Gutierrez, security and risk management consultant here at WithSecure. I have about 6 years of experience working with major financial institutions here in New York. I'm a security architect, performing security design reviews with a touch of web application security assessments as well. I've worked a bit on the other side, drafting and explaining some of these architectures to satisfy third-party auditors, mainly for SWIFT TSP and for NYDFS as well. Moving on, a quick reminder, if any of the attendees have any questions, you can go ahead and submit those questions using the questions and comments box below, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. All right, so our cybersecurity clinics, I'll just give you a quick introduction here. So this presentation is the third in our series of ongoing DFS webinars, and we're happy to announce that we'll begin to offer clinics to preview our Cyber Maturity Assessment Services, CMA assessments. This is a bit broader than DFS in general, but we'll be performing a sample clinic later to give you a preview of the service. In case you missed some of our previous sessions, John has a couple of slides to give you a quick catch-up.
So this is the next in our continuing series of NYDFS 500 webinars. In prior episode, we covered the enforcement actions, which are the penalties that are imposed by DFS for non-compliance with its regulations. One of the things we looked at in these enforcement actions is a description of the security incident that resulted in the enforcement action. And it should be no surprise that majority of these involved phishing attacks as the attack vector. And the main impact that we saw was exposure of non-public information. Go to the next slide. With regard to penalties, so you see that there's been a ramp up in the penalties that are being assessed since 2020. The average penalty is around $3 million. So we saw a range of penalties, but it's significant expense that related to non-compliance with the regulation.
So as Miguel mentioned, we're happy to announce that we're offering these free Cyber Maturity Assessment or CMA clinics. They're 1-hour clinics where we work with you on a framework of your choice. Today we're choosing DFS, but it may not necessarily be a DFS, of course. By participating in one of our CMA clinics, you'll gain valuable insights into potential security risks and improvement opportunities for your organization. You may obtain a better understanding of our consulting assessment process and methodologies. You'll directly expose your key stakeholders to WithSecure Consulting CMA's offering, enabling them to more effectively evaluate our service. And it will help to determine if the WithSecure Consulting CMA service will meet your needs and provide value to your organization. We will be posting a sign up on our website probably within the next 24 hours. There'll be an email going out to all participants when it's up, likely tomorrow, as mentioned. And so how does it work? Just a quick overview of what we'll be doing in the next 55 minutes or so. So for one of these clinics, you might choose a sample section from your preferred security framework or regulation. Today, we're choosing access privilege and management, which is a section of the DFS Amendment 500. You would complete our contact form on the website, and one of our account directors will reach out to you to plan the clinic. We would engage with your key stakeholders. Our WithSecure account director would schedule time with consultants and the stakeholder. It's typically a 2 to 4 week lead time. And a clinic will simulate basically a typical workshop within a CMA engagement. Now, again, obviously, this is just a 1-hour workshop that's meant to be part of a larger series of workshops when doing a true CMA engagement. We consultants would ask your stakeholders to walk through security practices, ask questions to evaluate your alignment with the selected framework, and identify strengths and improvement opportunities. We'll conclude the clinic with a review of high-level findings and recommendations. And clinics may be delivered online or in person if you're located in one of WithSecure's primary locations. So again, this webinar will be an example of what one of these clinics might look like.
And without further ado, on to our live demonstration. Today we're going to be covering section 500.7 of the NYDFS regulation, access privileges and management.
I can start with, so section A, there are 6 requirements. The first one is to limit user access privileges to information systems that provide access to non-public information to only those necessary to perform the job function. So in a clinic, we would ask you, how do you identify entitlements that grant access to NPI? This can often be a challenge and may require some manual adding of metadata to your entitlements information. So hopefully you have an entitlement store or database that you're able to flag entitlements that do grant access to NPI so that you can identify and isolate those. With regard to managing these entitlements, one best practice is to use role-based access control, where you bundle entitlements into roles based on job function. In this way, you can more easily show that a particular user is only being granted entitlements that are appropriate to their role, rather than the challenge of trying to manage all of these entitlements individually for each user. One thing we'll look for here is that you have a request and approval process for access to NPI entitlements and hopefully all other entitlements. And that you have educated and ensure your managers and system owners understand that in approving access to NPI, it's their responsibility to ensure that the user does in fact need this access in order to perform their job role. Some tests that are likely done around this would be looking for randomly selecting a NPI access entitlement, and then looking for justification for the list of users who have that entitlement to show that that is in fact necessary for their job function. So that's the first requirement. For this requirement 2, I'll hand over to Rich.
Thanks, John. So requirement 2, again, is part of section A, access privileges and management. And it states, limit the number of privileged accounts and limit the access functions of privileged accounts to only those necessary to perform the user's job. So with that, we may ask questions such as, how do you define and identify privileged access? Do you have a privileged access policy, either as a standalone policy or a subsection of your access policy? How do you automatically detect privileged access in the environment? And we have some other questions, but I'm going to kind of take a question from those and review what it might look like. So how do you manage the number and scope of privileged accounts, right? In a non-compliant organization, we would find and have found that no controls exist. So privileged accounts are numerous. They might be used for general tasks. And that's a completely non-compliant organization. In organizations that are partially compliant, you might see that some limits exist, but privileged accounts are used for non-essential functions. So you might see that as a privileged account individual has a single account on the system and it's completely privileged. They use that account for day-to-day use, and they don't actually have a split account segment where they take an elevated account access for specific tasks. Now, a fully compliant organization is going to have privileged accounts that are completely minimized, restricted to the critical functions, and reviewed periodically. So what kind of recommendations might we provide based on these questions and these concerns? One might be to deploy a privileged access management or PAM solution, and you're going to hear PAM a lot during this. And that's going to enforce control over privileged accounts. We might ask you about defining privileged accounts in policies and ensuring that their scope is aligned with the business's needs. Further, we might suggest that you schedule reviews of privileged accounts to remove unused or unnecessary permissions. And lastly, we might indicate that monitoring systems to log and review activities performed by privileged accounts is going to benefit you and help you to meet a fully compliant criteria. Now, there's a requirement for Class A companies to use a PAM solution, but we do feel that that is a benefit to most companies. There are potential downsides to that as well in terms of the amount of effort required to get a PAM solution in place. But other questions that we might ask you involve in regards to requirement number 2A is who in your company decides what function requires access to privileged accounts? And you can kind of decide, or we can determine what is compliant, what's not compliant. In terms of a non-compliant organization may have no formal decision-making process. Access is granted on ad hoc basis, whereas a fully compliant organization, decisions are made by designated security teams or management based on formal policies that they rely on. So that having been said, recommendations, technical guidance that we would provide in regards to this might be to establish a formal approval process involving IT and security and management, maintain a central audit trail for all privileged access requests and decisions, and include justification fields in access request forms to improve accountability. And now we're going to move on to A3, and I believe Miguel is going to take this one.
Richard, you touched on some of the topics covered in A3 before, but I think this is included as a separate point by NYDFS because they really want to underscore that they require you to limit the use of privileged accounts to only essential tasks. And so some of the questions we might ask to get a good answer on this is there at least a policy to prohibit users from performing routine activities on these privileged accounts? And then what technical controls are in place to enforce this? Do you have this PAM solution implemented to enforce the segmentation between routine and privileged accounts and to monitor these privileged accounts even further? Just like before, for these non-compliant organizations, we'll see that these privileged accounts, you elevate your privileges and then continue to use this account for routine tasks, email and web browsing, things that shouldn't be done in a privileged account that you can do on your routine account. But in the end, what we really want to see is a defined policy and controls for enforcement. And we've got section A4.
So the requirement 4 is to periodically, but at a minimum annually, review all user access privileges and remove or disable accounts and access that's no longer necessary. So in doing a review or clinic on this requirement, we would ask, how do you educate your managers on their role and responsibility in doing access certifications. What we want to avoid is the rubber stamping, where a manager is busy and doesn't really understand what access his team has, and is just clicking approve to complete the activity, but without doing a really meaningful or thoughtful review on who needs which access. We may look for another practice we've seen in some organizations where employees do a first pass in certifying their own access, where they may have a better understanding, even than their manager likely do, of what access they need, what access they don't need, so that they can screen out any access that they know they no longer require. We will also investigate how do you ensure that all entitlements are included in certifications. And this can be a significant challenge, especially if you have got, dozens, hundreds, thousands of applications, ensuring that each one of those applications is sending a complete and accurate access list to the recertification engine or tool. Also ensuring that those entitlements are meaningful, so that the manager or person certifying the access understands what it is they are certifying, and that the description is in plain English and understandable in the context of their business function. We also would look to see, are privileged access or access to NPI explicitly reflected in the certification, so that managers are aware that when they are approving an access rights, that they know which of those are granting access to sensitive data and which of those are granting privileged access to systems as well. Another thing that we would look for is, how do you post certification? How do you do reconciliation and review to ensure that all the decertified access is being removed in a timely manner? I think that this is another area that can and does go wrong, that the communication flow from the certification process back to the system owners on access that was need to be revoked. There's a breakdown in that process. Either the notification is not sent to the right person, or it's not actioned upon accordingly, or it's not actioned in a timely manner. So in reviews and testing of certification process, this is a common point to explore, that provide a list of decertified access, and then provide from the last cycle, and then provide evidence logs showing that access was in fact removed, and removed in a timely manner. And then the other thing we may ask about is, do you recertify privileged access on a more frequent basis? So the regulation requires that access be recertified at least annually, but for privileged access, best practice is to do that more frequently, at least on a quarterly basis, so that you don't have unnecessary privileged access out in the environment for extended periods. Number 5, I think, Richard, you're going to cover that.
I am. Before we get to that, there's a question that was posted in the chat by one of our participants, and that is, what's the most effective way to limit the use of privileged accounts? And I'd like to address that before moving on to number 5. And this is just kind of at a high level. You would want to adopt the principle of least privilege, ensuring that users have access only to the information and resources necessary. We recommend implementing just-in-time access, which means that privileged accounts can only be active when needed for specific tasks and get deactivated immediately afterwards. And some of these you're going to see we touch upon in other sections of this as well, and may have already touched upon. You want to do a regular review of privileged access. For Class A companies and those that have the appetite for it, you'll want to deploy a PAM solution, Privileged Access Management Solution. Obviously, you need to enforce MFA, which is a requirement regardless. And you'll want to establish strong password policies. Last but not least, you'll want to monitor privileged account activities. So there's not really one effective solution for this. It is a bundle of tasks and a bundle of policy that you'll want to have in place in order to do this. But it will work to mitigate your concerns and to limit use of privileged accounts. Moving on to 5A, this requirement is disable or securely configure all protocols that permit remote control of devices. I think that this is one that's near and dear to my heart, of course, because RDP has had such a sordid history of being insecure. But let's talk about some questions that we might ask you. So we would ask for an inventory of remote control use cases from an organization. We would ask, how do you securely configure the use of remote control protocols? So in other words, MFA, authorization, IP allow listing. How do you detect unauthorized use of remote protocols, aka network monitoring? And how do you ensure that systems disable remote protocols if not required? So another question that we might answer is, how do you manage remote control protocols like RDP to prevent unauthorized access? And in a non-compliant organization, an answer that we might get is, we don't. In which case, remote protocols are enabled by default and there's no additional security measures. I think everybody on this call is aware that that is highly insecure and not recommended. So what would we see with partially compliant organizations? They might tell us that some protocols are secured, but not all are reviewed or disabled when unnecessary. What you want to see for a fully compliant organization is that remote control protocols are disabled unless required and are securely configured with encryption and MFA. So what does that look like from a recommendation and technical guidance perspective? It means conduct an inventorying of all active remote control protocols and disable those not in use. It means using encryption, TLS 1.2 or greater, and firewalls. It means requiring MFA for remote protocol access. Further, we recommend regularly pen testing and auditing remote access controls. And last but not least, we suggest you implement tools for session monitoring so that you can detect unauthorized activities on remote protocols. It sounds straightforward and easily wrappable into a package, but obviously for anyone who's attempted to do this before, it has a lot of effort behind it. And with that, I think we'll move on to A6.
This is terminating access. So the main question here that we want to look to answer is, how quickly can your organization revoke access when an employee leaves? And so it's kind of similar to before. We want to make sure that there's a policy defined. Has your organization defined timelines within an SLA for access revocation? Do you have checklists for employee exit procedures so that this step isn't overlooked? Is there any integration between tools that HR uses and the IAM systems that IT administers to automate the account deprovisioning? Ideally, we'd like to see this be fully automatic. HR's departure procedures are linked to IT, and deprovisioning can happen within minutes of that departure notification being sent. In non-compliant situations, what we often see is that this process is completely manual, and this leaves a lot of room for error and communication breakdowns between HR and IT. And this can lead to deactivation delays after departure of days, weeks, and it's really difficult to tell because there isn't that visibility between these two systems to begin with. That's no good. That leaves greater surface area for compromise. This wraps up Section A, and we're moving on to Section B, password policy.
So requirement for Section B is, to the extent passwords are employed as a method of authentication, the covered entity shall implement a written password policy that meets industry standards. It doesn't specifically say you need to implement that policy, but that's really the challenging part, especially for systems that don't use the standard Active Directory or SSO authentication. So for a clinic or assessment, what we would look for is, do you have an inventory of systems that fall out of your standard authentication methodology? And for those systems, how do you ensure that the password policy is enforced? And if there's any limitations, it could be with legacy systems. We would look for, do you implement any compensating controls to around not following the corporate standard password policy, and also have you raised and do you have risk exceptions that have been approved around these systems that aren't able to meet those meet the policy requirements. And then you should also look to provide, evidence. How do you, for each of the systems that aren't following the standard authentication flows, how do you evidence that the documented evidence that the alternate controls are in place to ensure that those systems are meeting your password policy? I think that's the only requirement for Section B. So I guess we'll now move to C around Class A companies. Miguel?
Section C. So, important reminder, these following two requirements are only applicable to Class A companies. And the first requirement of these is for companies to have a privileged access management or PAM solution. Implementing these can be a really complex and expensive process to begin with, but more so if your organization wants to make sure that these are implemented well and within NYDFS's requirements to be compliant with regulation. So you want to make sure that you not only just have one, but that it's implemented well and will make DFS happy. And so to do this, the questions we'll ask, what we really want to be interested in are these edge cases. So in most cases, what we'll see is Windows and Unix accounts, pretty straightforward to onboard onto your PAM. But have you cataloged your application level accounts that might have administrative access? That might require a bit more fine tuning and manual work. Think about legacy systems that can't directly or easily interface with your PAM. What compensating controls do you have for some of the features that your PAM might provide? So think about session monitoring or password rotation. It's not as simple as purchasing something off the shelf. You have to make sure that it's configured well and covers all of your infrastructure. I pass this on to Richard to go over the password requirements for these Class A companies.
Thanks, Miguel. So this is section C2, passwords. And again, this is for Class A companies. Each Class A company shall monitor privileged access activity and shall implement an automated method of blocking commonly used passwords for all accounts on all information systems. Now, this requirement differs from policies that enforce password complexity. And we would recommend implementation of a tool that continually monitors for common or easily guessed passwords. This reminds me of a client whom I visited in Texas, a financial industry client who offered me the opportunity to crack their password hashes for their AD. And within 24 hours I had. And what it revealed was a lot of sports teams in the Texas area being used in the passwords, including for several AD administrative accounts. And so we assisted them in learning a valuable lesson at that time, which in part was to add sports teams to their disallow list of passwords. I think it was very valuable, according to the client at the time. But some questions that we might ask in a workshop involving this would be, do you actively prevent the use of weak or commonly used passwords? What criteria or standards define commonly used passwords in your organization? How do you implement equivalent controls when password restrictions aren't feasible? How do you review and update the list of commonly used passwords? And are users notified or prevented from using previously compromised passwords? And I do see that there is a question in the chat that we'll get to about tools that can be used to meet these requirements. But before we do, I just want to give you an idea of what non-compliance looks like versus compliance in these cases. So no controls typically would exist in a non-compliant organization to block weak or commonly used passwords. However, robust measures such as automated password filtering tools or tools that ensure weak or commonly used passwords are consistently blocked would be in place. Definitions. So for implementing a tool, how do you implement equivalent controls when password restrictions aren't feasible? No equivalent controls are considered for a non-compliant organization. For a compliant organization, you're going to consider strong equivalent controls such as hardware tokens or MFA. And these would be considered a compensatory control. If password restrictions aren't feasible, you might implement these controls or prioritize the use of password managers and other mitigating technologies. In terms of are users notified or prevented from using previously compromised passwords, for instance, a non-compliant organization obviously is not going to have any control over that, but one that's fully compliant will have some way of automatically notifying and preventing a user from selecting compromised passwords based on breach databases or internal monitoring systems. And again, there's a question in the chat about these tools. I think I'm going to pass that question along to John because we had discussed that previously.
Sure. So for Active Directory does provide this natively. There's Service Active Directory password protection. And then on the Unix side, there's a tool called cracklib that does the same function. And essentially what these tools do is continually check your password hashes against the dictionaries that are commonly used by attackers. So when attempting to bypass passwords, attackers will use word lists of common passwords or rainbow tables of common password hashes in order to try to guess the passwords. These tools will essentially scan your environment, similar to what Richard did for the client he mentioned in Texas, but on automated fashion will continually scan your password hashes against these lists that are used to identify if any passwords are appearing on those lists.
And one I'd just like to shout out is the Have I Been Pwned API, which many of these tools reference, but is available outside of them as well.
Yeah.
So we have a question. What PAM solutions does WithSecure recommend?
I can take that one. So we don't make recommendations on specific vendors or tools, but what we could do is to help you to define requirements for your selecting a PAM solution and then define selection criteria and identify available solutions and identify selection criteria that you can use to make an informed decision on which of the tools is best for you. There's a lot of these tools available in the industry that are commonly used by a lot of our clients, but we would not make a particular recommendation, but rather provide guidance around how to select the solution that best fits your organization.
So if anybody else has any other questions, please put them in the chat. We kind of flew through this because typically these types of this would involve a back and forth with stakeholders, as mentioned at the beginning, and we're just kind of giving it to you in a flat kind of format. So typically discussions like this would involve a lot of back and forth with these stakeholders, a lot of questions that you've heard us ask, and many others. I see there's a question that's been placed. Can you deep dive into the data requirements? Do we need data encryption everywhere? Client data is hosted on the cloud versus on-prem requirements. So I'll take this one if that's all right with everybody. So DFS encryption requirements specifically state that encryption is mandated for NPI, non-public information, both in transit and at rest. If encryption is deemed infeasible in transit, covered entities must implement compensating controls, with these controls reviewed and approved by the CISO at least once per year. The regulation does not specify encryption for all data universally. However, I would add as a caveat that we at WithSecure recommend encryption for all data universally. But the regulation specifically focuses on protecting NPI. It's important to note that the regulation, the Second Amendment, Part 500, took effect already, and that covered entities had until November 1st of this year to comply with the updated encryption requirements. So I see another question. If you're unable to provide secure remote access through existing infrastructure, how might we add that on without having to modify said infrastructure? I could take this, or if John, Miguel, would either of you prefer to?
I think you do best on that one.
Sure. So there's a couple of options that come to mind. Bastion hosts, jump boxes, VDIs are probably the three things that come to mind first. If you're unfamiliar with any of these, in a very high level, Bastion hosts are hardened. They're specifically designed to provide access from an external place to a private network. They act as a hardened entry point for SSH, RDP, other connections, and they typically allow for things such as logging, auditing, and access control policies. Whereas jump boxes are used kind of as an intermediary system to allow you to hop from one system to another within a network. They're typically more commonly used for internal network setups where you don't want direct access to certain machines. So they're very similar, but I guess the biggest takeaway separating them is that jump boxes are typically meant to hop between segmented network access, and Bastion hosts are hardened for external network access. Whereas VDIs, virtual desktop interfaces, are typically hardened by their nature. They require any computer with a Citrix client or other type of client on it, which can then open up your remote desktop, and all of your data is stored on the host system. So those are the three that come to mind for securing existing infrastructure that you might not be able to modify. I'm not seeing any other questions. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, just thanks for that, Richard.
Oh, yeah, of course. So we'll give everybody just a few seconds to add any other questions, and if not, we will give you all a few minutes of your time back today, but hopefully this has been informative and interesting and gives you an idea of what these clinics look like. Again, you know, it was a bit of a one-sided monologue from the three of us, but I think you can get the gist in terms of how it might look when you have your stakeholders asking questions, responding to our questions, and uncovering concerns, as well as security triumphs. So that being said, I don't see any other questions in the chat. I'd like to thank everybody for attending. These webinars have been a wild success from our end. We've had great attendance throughout all of them throughout 2024. And as we close out this year, we're going to ask you to keep your eyes peeled for 2025. We will be bringing them back. And there's a QR code here to sign up for your clinic. If you're interested in having a more private session with us that focuses on your concerns, or basically gives you an idea, a better idea of how we can work with your organization to help you uncover potential uplifts and ways that you can more easily comply with regulations and frameworks. That having been said, thank you to my co-webinar folks. This would not have been possible without John, Miguel, our folks in the back end, Adrian, Susanna, Kelly. Thank you, everybody, for your hard work and participation. And we appreciate everybody attending. It's been fantastic this year. Thank you very much. We'll look forward to seeing you all next time.
Thank you.
Thank you all.